Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. At the end of our conversation last week, we were having a discussion about how place, or about how knowing the history of where you live, can help give you insight for the context in which you are currently living. Why do things look the way they do around your neighborhood? Why is your city set up the way that it is? Why do decisions from the past influence the present and ultimately the future of where we live? This is not the first time we've talked about place or proximity or anything like that on the podcast, and it certainly won't be the last. But what it brought to mind specifically was one of my favorite projects I've worked on over the last few years, something called Sankofa at Home. And what I want to do today is dig into that project and the underlying themes. What is it about understanding our history and the history of where we live, especially when it comes to justice, that can help us understand why things look the way they do today and how we can help shape the future? A part of understanding this is understanding what Sankofa means, and we'll dive into that today. But another piece of this is understanding how you can learn about the history of the place around you, how you can find resources about things that have happened in your city, and how events that happen nationally or even happen states away from where you live can influence what you see around you. So if you want to learn more about this, understanding place, history, and how this all impacts today and the future, join us for today's episode of the podcast. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources Podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Now, there are a couple foundational themes and experiences that lay the foundation for where this project even comes from, and the first of those is the idea of Sankofa. Sankofa has a number of different direct translations: to return, to go, to fetch, seek, and take, or to go back and get it. But broadly, the idea of Sankofa comes from the Akan people of Ghana, and it's a practice of looking back to move forward. It is only through knowing our history that we can begin to understand how we have gotten to where we are, and how to heal and repair our wounds and the wounds we see around us. For more than 20 years, different groups have been taking what are called Sankofa trips down to the southeastern part of the United States. Many of these end up emulating the Freedom Rides, taking buses from major cities in the southeast around the area to visit different historic sites and museums, to better understand the era of the civil rights movement, and to better understand the practice of slavery in the United States. As I said, a variety of groups do this. Both my college and seminary, either historically or currently, have some sort of experience along these lines. And different church denominations too. The Covenant Church has one that has been happening for more than 20 years, and other groups, including one that I recently worked with. And the whole purpose of the Sankofa trip, as previously mentioned, is to learn more about these different periods of history and to understand how that history has shaped where we are today, not just in that area of the country, but as the entire country. But what became clear to me, both in participating in one of these experiences and in other experiences I've had outside of it, is that this history spans all of our states, many of our cities, and there are different things that we can learn locally that help us understand what happened where we are and why we are where we are in the current place where we live. The final foundational piece here for me was after the killing of George Floyd and the many statements that came out from Minnesotans talking about how this is not the Minnesota that we know, or this is not the Minnesota that we grew up in. Because having the interests that I do, I knew at least a little bit about the history of the state of Minnesota, and that race played a foundational part in the way that the state was shaped early in its existence. And so one of the things I did that summer of 2020 was I drove from the Twin Cities down to Mankato, Minnesota. Back in 1862, there was a war between the Dakota people and the state of Minnesota for about 6 weeks during the end of that summer and the start of that fall. And what that conflict ultimately led to was the expulsion of the Dakota people from Minnesota, a concentration camp at Fort Snelling just outside of St. Paul, and the largest mass execution in United States history in Mankato. And so I went down to Mankato to visit, to see the memorial that's there, and to be in the place where this event happened. At the time, I had not yet been on a Sankofa trip down to the southeast, but I was aware of them, and I wondered what would it be like to explore those type of sites here in the state of Minnesota. And when I began to work for an organization that did Sankofa trips down to the southeast, I learned that they had also been wondering what it would look like to do that sort of experience here locally. And at the time, we did not have the means to actually make a trip happen. So the idea I had was, what if we wrote articles about the sites around the state and then encourage people to visit them on their own, give them some context for what they're walking into, and then help them learn more about the history of the place around them. And since we were a statewide organization, it was very important to me to include sites from around the state, because this is not just a cities thing. This is not just a uber urban sort of thing. Experiences like this have happened for people around different types of places, around our state, around other states. Now, I understand that not everyone listening to this is from Minnesota, so I'm not going to walk through each of the different articles we wrote and each of the different historical sites that we talked about. In fact, some of this information I already presented in episode 30 when we talked about the follow-up to the killing of Renee Good and about the Central neighborhood in Minneapolis. Instead, what I want to walk through is helping you figure out what are the types of places that you can maybe look for either around you, close to you, what are the types of places nationally that you could go to, and what are ways that you could find resources to help better understand how we have gotten to where we are today through the history that has either happened around you or in our country. Now, as always, one of the most important starting places is you. What is the posture that you're bringing into this journey of understanding? It is important to bring a posture of humility to everything that we do when it comes to learning about things, not just related to justice, learning about things in general, but especially about learning about things about justice. You will learn about a wide variety of topics when it comes to an idea like Sankofa. You'll learn about a wide variety of experiences, of very deeply painful things in our history, and about some things that are incredible and amazing about the resilience of people from our history. And that's another thing that was important for me to represent in these different articles and just broadly talking about history. There is a ton of pain in our history. There are a ton of unjust practices that happened. There are a ton of just really terrible things that have happened in our history. These are things that we need to know about because they shape where we are now. But there are also a ton of resilient people who fought against these things, who fought for justice. And it is important to see the beauty of those things as well. And importantly, as Christians, it's important to see where other Christians have worked for justice. It's important to understand the role that the church played in the history of our country and in the history of fighting for justice. And it's important to understand the story of God, where God's kingdom is leading us, and what it looks like for God's kingdom to be breaking into the world today. Now, as we move from that into thinking about different starting places for learning about history, either where you are or nationally, it's hard to give just one recommendation that covers everyone, because everyone is starting from a different place. In a lot of cases, I wouldn't necessarily recommend going on a Sankofa trip as your first experience. But at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily dissuade you from going on one either. Those experiences are deep, intense sort of experiences. You're around a group of people for about a week, maybe a little less, going to these very highly emotionally charged places. That said, some of the best resources and museums that you can experience are going to be on one of those trips, or at least in those locations if you were to go on a trip. If I were to recommend one place to go in the entire country to learn about these things, it would be the Equal Justice Initiative's legacy sites in Montgomery. EJI has done an incredible amount of work to build a museum in Montgomery, to build a site honoring the people who were killed throughout the lynching era. and more recently in building and developing a sculpture garden that helps you to understand some of what happened in these horrific sorts of ways through the beauty of artwork that has been created by different artists. But that's not the only place you can learn. There's a Civil Rights Institute in Birmingham, and in my experiences in Birmingham, I also got to be part of groups who met with a church and with the members of that church who were alive during the Civil Rights era and who got to talk about their experiences. Through this podcast and through the Biblical Justice Resources website, it's often easiest to recommend things like books or movies or different places to go to, and we'll talk about those. But it's also important to remember that a lot of people are still alive who actually experience these events. And if you can meet people like that, people who have those experiences, and learn from them, there is a first-hand sort of information that you will learn that you're not going to find anywhere else. Other important national museums include the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, which just finished building an extension onto that building, and the National Civil Rights Museum in Washington, D.C. Now, each of these places are places you could spend an incredible amount of time in. We had an entire day on my most recent trip devoted just to the EJI legacy sites, and I could have easily spent double that time there. When I visited the National Civil Rights Museum in Washington, D.C., I got through about half of one floor and realized I could spend multiple days on each floor. So you could easily spend 2 weeks in that museum just trying to take in everything that they have available for you to learn. But as I said, there are places around the country that deal with this history and that help educate the people of those places about their history. And that's why when I was building the Biblical Justice Resources website, it was important to me to have a museum and historical site page, and it was important to include places from each of the 50 United States that deal with this history in some way, shape, or form. Now, each of those sites that are listed on that page, and a lot of the places you would go on something like a Sankofa trip, are dedicated specifically to this history. But it's important to know that places that are more broad in their approach or more broad in the information they provide will also have history for you to explore about race, justice, and other things of that nature as it pertains to your locale or as it pertains to things that happened nationally. So here in Minnesota, I've mentioned in the past the Minnesota Historical Society and the Minnesota Historical Society Press. There is also a Minnesota History Museum in St. Paul. That is the type of place that deals broadly with the history of Minnesota, and that will include exhibits about things related to race and justice and those other related topics over time. So some of the easiest ways to know about things like that are to get onto their email lists or to follow them on social media, because they will broadcast those things as they cycle through those museums. And again, when it comes to learning interpersonally, when you get to those museums, talk to the people who helped form the exhibits. A couple years ago, I went to a museum at the Lower Sioux Agency, which deals with some of the history about the Dakota conflict that I mentioned previously. One of the people working at the site talked about how the exhibits had changed over the years to better reflect what the actual history of the area was. Because when it comes to thinking about a people group, that people group could be spread broadly across a wide range of places. And the Dakota and the Lakota and the Nakota are no different. So there was information included about places further west that was no longer true in the 1850s and 60s when it came to the Dakota in Minnesota. And so learning from those historians, learning from the people who work in those places is incredibly beneficial when it comes to better understanding what happened and to helping correct either incorrect information or misconceptions about a certain topic, a certain event, or things of that nature. Now, when it comes to something like a Sankofa trip, or when it came to something like the Sankofa at Home series, it's important to find some places where you can actually spend some time experiencing the area or walking through the museum. But that's not the only type of place that you could visit to learn. One of the things I've done in the past, and that I would invite you to do as well, is to visit a website called the Historical Marker Database. There are historical markers in the form of signs set up across the United States. Different groups put them up, they've been put up at different points in history, and they have some way of explaining what happened in a specific place. I don't know what it is about humans, but there is something about being in a place where something happened that helps us experience it and understand it in a way that we can't learn any other way. So after I went on my aforementioned visit to Mankato, I went a couple other times to southern Minnesota to where these different markers are about different things that happened during the U.S. Dakota War of 1862. And whether quote-unquote real or quote-unquote perceived, I felt a connection that I didn't feel I could have had in any other way other than by being at the place where something happened. The practice of presence, the practice of actually going out to a place, is important in this process because it doesn't just help us orient our minds, it helps us orient our entire being into understanding what has happened around us, what the history is around us, and how we've come to where we are today. Now, an important thing to know is that this is also going to take a level of discernment. Throughout those specific trips to visiting markers for that specific conflict, I encountered things that were created fairly recently, within the last 10 or 20 years, and I encountered things that were created 100 or 150 years ago. And the way that that conflict is discussed on each of those types of markers is different based on the time period when it was created. Perhaps it's no surprise that people directly involved in the conflict would feel some sort of way as the victors and would describe their actions in some way. And perhaps it's no surprise that people today might be able to be a little more objective about what happened. But you could see that in the words that were used and in the way things were discussed on each of those different historical monuments and those historical markers. And that's just another way to learn. How did people perceive what was happening at the time, and how do we understand it today? So that discernment is necessary to have a better understanding of what justice looks like, how different people were perceived at the time when events happened and how they're perceived now, and maybe even where places are that our growth and understanding is continuing to develop. Now with this, it's important to know that historic events are not the only thing that shaped America. There was also deliberate practice of shaping the cities that we live in. That's where terms and practices like racial housing covenants or redlining come into play. We largely live where we do based on practices from 100 years ago. And the understanding of why we can determine different things like housing and education and incarceration rates and hunger based on zip code comes back to that understanding. So there are resources like the Color of Law that can help us develop that knowledge. And there are organizations like Mapping Prejudice, based out of the University of Minnesota, which are going through and documenting those racial housing covenants. They began here in Minnesota with Hennepin County, which is the county where Minneapolis is, but they've expanded their work around the state and ultimately around the country. And they're helping to show how those covenants shape the neighborhoods where we live today. And then to bring it even more locally, there are churches and institutions in your neighborhood that have been doing work for an extended period of time, and that have helped shape your neighborhood or have helped develop your neighborhood. It's organizations that were on the ground during the civil rights movement like the NAACP or the Urban League. It's community centers like the Phyllis Wheatley Center in Minneapolis or the Hallie Q. Brown Center in St. Paul. It's churches that have been around for 100 or 150 or 200 years that have been doing the work of justice. And it's places that someone like me who may not live in your city won't know about, but that people who do live in your city will know about. And something I've learned while doing this podcast is even if you're like me and you don't like sending cold emails to try and connect with people, sometimes people will respond and you'll be able to develop a relationship with those people. You'll be able to learn from those people. You'll be able to build friendships with those people. So these are the ways that we can learn about the places where we live. We can find national museums to learn about the history that has influenced the entire country. We can find local museums or organizations or churches who are on the ground doing things around different historical events, or who have been working for justice for an extended period of time. We can read books, either academic works that are put out by universities, or works that are put out by our local historical societies. And we can connect directly with the people who live in these neighborhoods and who have built their lives around being people of justice and pursuing justice in their communities. The last place to mention, as we said last week, is your local library. Libraries obviously have troves of books, but that's not the only thing they have. They have a dedicated team of people who are looking to help you find resources, looking to help you learn about whatever it is you're trying to learn about. And in a lot of cases, they're going to have historical resources from the place where you live. And that's just another type of resource that will help you learn about that place, learn about the history of where you are, and build a better understanding about your community. So this is just a starting point. This is just a way to get into the conversation. We're going to continue talking about place in the near future, and we're going to explore why it is so important for us to understand places, to go out and experience places, and why this can help us continue to pursue biblical justice. Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.